important stuff. But what I'd like to do is to share with you some of the questions that people ask me about trees. And I'll give you a little sort of insight, I hope, into how I go about answering those, which might be helpful in the way that you communicate about trees. So one of the first questions that people ask me when I give talks and so on associated with one of the books is, how did you get interested in trees? And scientists often forget that the audiences they have are as much interested in you and in people as they are about your subject matter. So one of the things that I said in the introduction to the book was, one of my earliest memories is of a spectacular cedar of Lebanon near our home. One winter morning we found it dead, its trunk and limbs strewn haphazardly and being sawn up. It had been struck by lightning. That was the first time I saw my father cry. I thought about the huge, heavy, beautiful tree that was hundreds of years old and that I had thought invincible and wasn't. And my father, who I had thought would always be in benign control of everything and wasn't. I recall my mother saying that there had been a whole world in that tree. I remember puzzling over that. But my mother was right. There was a whole world in that tree. And so there is in every tree. They warrant our appreciation, and many of them need our protection. So there's me with my dad. I'm the one on the right, on my right anyway, the little guy. And you can tell that my father is a recent immigrant to the country because he's wearing a suit and hat to go to Kew Gardens on a Saturday afternoon. And the way that he got me interested in botany was by feeding me bits of plants. You'll recognize the opium poppy and the lick I had of that opium. I remember the sort of sensation on my tongue. I remember even more clearly the sensation of my school teacher and her horror, and the social worker who came round to check on us. My mother saying, "It's only opium, for goodness sake." And Dieffenbachia, which is a poisonous plant, don't feed that to your kids. But my dad did give me a little tiny bit, and he said, "This is going to hurt." You'll understand, of course, why it hurt. I don't need to explain that to this audience. And he used that plant to introduce to me the horrors of slavery. This plant was used as a punishment in the southern states for slaves. You know, through those stories, which were actually quite science-based, I got very interested in plants, and then more specifically about trees. And I was just amazed when I started traveling with Kew or with the BBC at the incredible diversity of trees, just an extraordinary range just even within the trees. And I love the fact that when you ask people, what is a tree? There's no better definition than it's just a sort of big thing with a woody stem, which is another question that people ask, what is a tree? So, you know, one of the things that I've learned is to talk about trees in terms that people can identify with, and I'll come on to food, water, defense, and so on. But beware in all this, the pitfalls of anthropomorphizing, because people really want to anthropomorphize about trees. So here's a question that I asked people who had recently got science degrees from various universities and were at Bristol University studying for PGCE, in other words, studying to become teachers. So these are all people with science degrees. Tiny seed weighs next to nothing, tree weighs a lot. Where does all the stuff come from? And in particular, where does all that mass that makes up a bag of charcoal come from? Now, I'm not going to ask you that question because you all know the answer, right? I hope you do. But I asked that question 15 years running of a group of 60 people. And I asked it with exactly the same wording, which is not exactly what's on the screen there. And the results were remarkably consistent, that every year, 85% of those people said the stuff has all come out of the ground. You know, it was very clear that they thought that there was water that came up through the roots, and all the nutrients and all the stuff that makes trees comes out of the ground. Now, that's quite an important thing for people to understand maybe better than that if we want to talk to them about climate change and greenhouse gases. Another question that people have is, how tall can trees grow? One of the things I like about this is that wherever you are in the world, the very, very tallest examples of the very, very tallest trees that either exist now or have ever existed in the fossil record have been about the same height. So, you know, give or take about 120 meters. And I'm talking as an engineer here, not as a mathematician, right? So about that height. And and the very, very tallest examples, the Douglas fir or the swamp gum or whatever, they're all about that, that height. Now, that's an interesting coincidence. And the coincidence is because, you know, there is a theory that it's because of, that's the sort of limit to how far you can get water up a tree. And if you ascribe to the tension cohesion theory, and I know there are other theories about how water gets up to the very top of the tree, then, you know, that's the sort of maximum column that you can support because of the strength of the hydrogen atom, hydrogen and oxygen bonds in water, allowing it to cohere. And you can talk about droplets on anoraks and all that kind of thing. But I like the idea that anywhere in the universe with the same gravity, the trees are going to be the same height, and that's to do with water. So, you know, one of the things that puzzles people is how trees defend themselves. And, you know, clearly when an insect or any other herbivore sees this scene, they're probably thinking lunch, and there's me anthropomorphizing, of course. But trees can't run away. How do they defend themselves? And this is an opportunity not only to kind of marvel at all the amazing kind of structures and so on that trees have developed, but also you know, the spines and the poisons in manchineel, the two-part poison, which is a kind of interesting one in cherry laurel. You can talk about caffeine, which is sort of mildly poisonous, but also discourages other plants from growing nearby. But some of the ones that people really kind of grab onto, that they really enjoy, are, you know, of course, oak trees, you know, they have tannins and so on to stop things eating them. But this idea that when a tree is under attack, some of those chemicals that are produced trigger other trees nearby to produce defense chemicals as well. And one of the things I found is that people ascribe agency to the trees and intentionality, so that they, and it's very difficult to avoid the language which says, you know, for example, trees send out signals. Well, you know, signals are sent out, but sending out implies an agency which isn't necessarily there. So one has to be a bit careful about the anthropomorphizing. And I'll come back to that a little bit later on. On the bottom left here is an example of a leaf that's been, you know, eaten by something. And you ask people, what do these droplets contain? And they all say, you know, well, some sort of poison maybe, or some sort of fluid from the tree that's, you know, going to, you know, discourage, or maybe it's just sweet sap or what have you. And when you say, well, there are some plants that when they're attacked, they send out signals within what's being exuded there that attract the things that eat the things that are eating it. And I gave a talk about trees at GCHQ once, and there was a sort of deathly silence in the room when I talked about that. That you know, the sophistication of attacking the thing that is attacking you is something that resonated with both the public generally and that particular audience. So then, you know, there are some rather wonderful examples from around the world of trees that protect themselves in interesting ways and have evolved defenses. So the whistling thorn, Dendrobium, from East Africa, has these sort of domi, these little houses that they've got at the base of the thorns for ants. And those incredibly aggressive ants will actually fight to the death other colonies of ants in nearby trees if the branches swish together. But something like as big as an elephant wouldn't really mind about those thorns probably. the sound of the wind rushing through those thorns makes a kind of whistling noise. And elephants have learned to associate that whistling noise with the rather aggressive ants, which they really do care about. People have tried playing the sound of the whistling thorn to herds of elephants, and there are some claims that they trundle away as a result. The sort of stories that are around some of the some of the trees and their defences are very human. So the kauri trees, Agathis australis from New Zealand, they laid down, not intentionally of course, layers of resin over thousands of years, which in the 19th century became very valuable to prospectors who would come along with twangy things that they'd pop into the ground and listen for the change of tone as they twanged, to find large lumps of resin, sometimes 30 kilos at a time, that they would ship back to the old country, Britain, and was used for making varnish for the empire, outdoor varnish. And that resin prospecting trade enabled New Zealand to sort of pay out of the taxes on this for its modern infrastructure, which included, of course, ironically and sadly, felling a lot of the forests. There's the story of gutta percha, which I don't have time to go into detail, but in the end of the 19th century, gutta percha, which protects itself not with a resin this time, but with a latex. That latex was used for all sorts of entrepreneurial uses, like sort of kitchen gadgets and funnels and jugs and things, because it was easily molded. And also for golf balls. But the way it changed the world was that it made the best submarine cables. It was an underwater insulator par excellence. And after a few decades, there were 250,000 miles. This is obviously before that 250,000 miles of submarine cables insulated with gutta percha, allowing countries to talk to each other. So gutta percha changed the world. And that again is a way, a sort of hook for people in understanding and valuing trees. And then there's the story of the alder tree, which is particularly, we all know it for its ability to fix nitrogen using bacteria in the root nodules. But it also is very, very rot resistant, very resistant to bacteria and some fungi. And the piles that support Venice, which have been there for 500 years, are largely alder wood, which not only enabled the city to build on top of a lagoon and so on, but also to project its power around the Mediterranean, because alder wood, as I'm sure you know if you read military manuals on this sort of thing, makes the best charcoal for the best gunpowder. And so their weaponry was based on alder wood, and on top of that, the best steel that they could make at the time had to use the best charcoal, and their forges used an enormous amount of alder wood for that. So it's a sort of interesting link between some of the properties of the tree and some of the ways that a whole empire projected its power around the Mediterranean. At the height of their power, they could build one ocean-going warship completely kitted out with all the things that one would need in terms of weaponry and steel and gunpowder and so on. They could build one a day at a place called the Arsenale, which of course gave us the word arsenal. And I guarantee you, after this talk, it's the stories, the human stories, that if you remember anything, you'll probably remember. So then there's the question of sex, or at least procreation. How do trees make baby trees? And this is an opportunity, obviously, to talk about the identical twins of some trees that propagate vegetatively, versus other and the drawbacks of being identical twins. So the elms in this country largely propagate, I believe, through suckers and so on. They obviously have seeds, but they propagate particularly well in another way. And it was the Romans who planted those all over the country for growing their vines up. They were partial to a bit of wine, and that made them particularly vulnerable. It's a great way of colonizing in the way that aspens do after a fire, but it has its drawbacks as well. So isn't there a better way? And of course, pollen is the way that sex cells are taken from one tree to another. And if you look at pollen under an electron microscope, then you can see how they're like little aerofoils. And in the species that are insect born, they're actually got little like Velcro hooks on them. But of course, this is a very inefficient way, wind-borne pollen, of getting the pollen to where it needs to go, which is why this very, very bioactive substance has to be pushed out in such enormous quantities, and why so many people are allergic to species like birch and all the grasses that have to pump out so much pollen. So the other way of doing it, for example, in this horse chestnut, is to use insects. And there's a nice story with horse chestnuts about each individual floret changing colour to signal to the insects that they don't have to, that they needn't visit anymore. They've already been visited. There is a common misconception that it's just bees that do pollinating. So it's quite interesting to look at trees which are red, which if they're naturally red rather than bred by us to be red, then it begs the question, if insects don't see red very well, then why are they red? And obviously they're pollinated by something else, either birds or butterflies. And bats, the whole story of durian and smelly fruit and so on, but also smelly flowers that come out at night and big and blousy, smell of sour milk and attract bats. People are interested in these things, I found. So then there's the question: you've made your baby trees. What stops them from competing with their parents? And as the public would see it, competing for food, but competing for light or anything else. And that's a way to talk about spreading seed, either by wind or by forgetful squirrels that sort of even plant your seeds for you and then forget where they put them. If you really want to go into it, you can then go into mast years and how clever that is. And of course, a lot of these yew berries and blackberries and so on are quite well tuned to bird vision. It's a nice time to, if for a British audience, you obviously want to get scatological and talk about toilets and lavatories, which always gets a laugh. Not particularly in any other country, I've found. But there's a question about why it is that so many fruit are laxative, and this is an opportunity to talk about the gut not being a really wonderful place to be if you're a seed that wants to survive. It's a hostile environment, but on the other hand, you need the animal to eat the fruit and distribute the seed somewhere else, but you want to kind of hurry it through. So that's why plants, fruits are generally laxative. And of course, the fruit is the seeds are deposited with a handy little pile of fertilizer as well. The traveller's tree, Ravenala madagascariensis, is a sort of kind of ridiculous, and to this audience I can say a ridiculous piece of design. Of course, I mean a ridiculous piece of evolution. And the reason it's called a traveller's tree is twofold. One is that you can sort of dig a straw into the bottom and suck out water, which is just about drinkable. Actually, it's full of horrible, wriggly little things. But anyway, if you're really caught, rather than in a garden like this, out in the outback somewhere, then I suppose that's useful. And the other reason is that apparently all the fans point in the same direction, so you can use it as a compass. that would be absolutely brilliant if it were true. And it is a story that is out there a lot. But if you look on Google Earth, you can see that these things are pointing in all sorts of different directions. And when I asked, they can't all be right. So when I asked Madagascan scientists who work for Kew out there, what gives? And they said, oh, it's just something we tell foreigners. I love that. But this tree, which is a relative of the strelitzias, the bird of paradise flower, you can probably see the sort of similar structures here. It's got a rather sort of strange thing about it, which is that the everywhere else on the planet, this family, they all have sort of red and sort of yellow and gold seeds. These ones, very unusually, have bright blue seeds. And the reason for this is that the thing that comes along and distributes those seeds is the permanently startled looking ruffed lemur. That's a sort of nice story, but then I found that this is a way in for people, because they like animals, to say if anything happens to this ruffed lemur, this tree has no other way of getting its seeds distributed. And the reason that they're bright blue is that Madagascar hived off from the rest of Africa about 90 million years ago, and the things like the ruffed lemur, unlike us and other apes, didn't develop trichromatic vision, didn't develop red, green, and blue. They just got green and blue receptors. So there's no point in producing something that they couldn't see. And obviously, these two things co-evolved. I say obviously, I believe they did. Now, that example of a tree becoming functionally extinct if something happens to the thing that spreads its seeds is a nice way in to talking about climate change, because climate change isn't just about temperature and rainfall, which is the popular view, right? So I think that that's what the public tend to think. It's, as you all know, it's about systems going out of kilter. As an earlier speaker today said, the insects that the tree might depend on for pollination, the organisms that might be around to spread the seeds somewhere else, they might not be around at the right time. And so when those systems go out of kilter, then you can have things which are functionally extinct. In other words, they can't have kids. So another one that comes up constantly are trees sentient? Are they intelligent? Do they communicate? Do trees have feelings? And this is something that is very, very popular in literature, whether it's Avatar or or Tolkien stories or fairy stories. I went to the wonderful Breakout Room 12 yesterday and met Dion Dobrinsky and Thomas Kay and their work at Birmingham about sort of wonder and enchantment, and is this actually a useful thing? Maybe do these stories give us greater attentiveness to real plants? Does it matter that the science isn't necessarily right? It's a sort of interesting point, really, because when it often we can learn about what's from what's popular, not so much about the trees themselves perhaps as scientists, but we might learn about public attitudes by engaging with those sort of films, novels, popular culture. And there are some things that some people at least really, really want to believe. And the mycorrhiza story, largely a result of Simard's work in British Columbia, but then that was taken up by popular science books and so on. We know the story about mycorrhizae. I don't have to tell this audience. It is a fantastic word for Scrabble, though. That story of interdependence between fungi and trees is nice, the interdependence between trees and trees is even better for the audience. They love that. And it's what they've kind of brought up in a way, wanting to believe. And there is a very strong feeling among many people that trees are sentient, that they're sending messages to each other. And of course, information is being transmitted, we know that, as are the products of photosynthesis. So there's information about being under attack, and there's also products of photosynthesis themselves that are traveling through fungal networks. However, we don't have any evidence, as far as I know, about agency in this. In other words, intentionality and you know, of sort of intelligence as we would understand it. And this is something that, when you're talking to audiences, is a really nice way in, because they can see that there's a sort of grey area here. Because, you know, amongst ourselves, we might actually think there is a kind of collective intelligence, I use the term loosely, in a forest, and not in the way that perhaps we think of intelligence, but there is a sort of, it's not completely you know, a fight for light. There is a sort of altruistic behavior of the community as a whole. And again, I understand the difficulty of anthropomorphizing. I would be using slightly different words if I was with a general public. So question is, you know, when it comes to superstition and emotion, are people with strong emotional connections to trees more likely to protect them? So we have the example of the baobabs in Madagascar. They've been left, everything else is being chopped down, but they've been left because the people believe the souls of their ancestors live in those trees. And when emotion spills into superstition or pseudoscience, is that necessarily a bad thing? And the thing is, sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't, and that's a big thing to discuss. I mean, I love the story of the beech tree in Germany. They say lightning never strikes a beech tree. And in fact, lightning strikes beech trees just as much as any other tree, I gather, if they're the same height and so on. But the beech trees survive. And the beech trees survive because they've got smooth bark, which is going to be wet all the way down and in a storm, and it acts as a lightning conductor rather than diverting the electricity through the tree itself, as a craggy old oak would do. So there's a sort of link there between a superstition and a piece of science. And finally, if you were a tree, what tree would you be? Is a lovely question that I've been asked, and I think it's a nice question to ask the public. And it can either be an individual tree or, in this case, a species. And look, I don't want to get into the pedantic question of whether Aloedendron dichotomum, the quiver tree, the aloe family, is actually a tree or not. You know, it's got a woody stem, and you know that'll do for me. But this one, by the way, I'm quite near the camera there, is about 40 feet high, and I love it, not because of its resilience in the Namib Desert, but because when people look at it, it's the national tree of Namibia. So it's like driving a Morris Minor, everyone's smiling at you. And secondly, it's got this sort of white coating, waxy coating, which powdery thing that sort of stops damage from ultraviolet light. You know, so people want to stroke it. So the idea of being a tree that people want to stroke and makes people smile, I think that would be the tree that I'd like to be. And finally then, trees need love. And remember, hearts and minds, emotion cells. So you use your own feelings, your own opinions, and your own experiences in life to communicate. And Happy New Year. You might not realize today, very auspiciously for a tree conference, is the Jewish New Year of Trees. It's called Tu B'Shvat. And it's a time of tree planting and tree celebration. And you know, there are other cultures that have those moments as well. So Happy New Year for trees, for those that want to celebrate that, and do stay in touch. That's me done.
Wow, well, that's brilliant, John. Thank you very much. Really, really interesting talk. And you can tell also